Hi team, Miss Vaughn here to read to you chapter 10 of Beloved. There's a couple of things that I just want to talk about and address before we dive right into the chapter. One is that I want to preface this with the fact that this chapter focuses on Paul D. So in your book on page 125, you should write chapter 10 and then also write that this focuses on Paul D, specifically his time in Alfred, Georgia. I've had you guys note in your book multiple times that whenever Alfred, Georgia is mentioned, we should have picked up on the fact that it was not a great experience for him, and details of that experience are going to be really developed in depth here. The other thing that I want to talk to you about before we begin reading is the framing of this chapter. So starting in chapter 7, the previous chapter that I read to you all, Beloved's return to her human form has her very hungry for stories about Setha's past. And she's really hungry about stories of Setha's past because she's trying to figure out why she was murdered. And so we've talked about this in class, that someone's past often is it influences to a great degree the way that we take action, the way that we see things, the way that we understand things about what's happening around us and also ourselves. So Beloved's trying to gather all of that data from Setha, but she, in the process, is making Setha come to terms with her past. And we've seen at several points that Setha likes to keep her past very guarded. Beloved is not only doing this to Setha, she's also doing it to Denver. So in chapter 9, when we were reading it, Denver has that moment where she feels really heartbroken at the fact that Beloved has not returned for her, but for Setha. And then it makes Denver start to think about why she was so lonely at 124 as a child. And then that makes Denver think about when she was in school, a boy, Nelson Lord, confronts Denver and asks her a question that wasn't intended to be confrontational or mean, but he does ask her a question that never gets explicitly stated, but we as a class talked about it. He probably asked her, "Hey, aren't you that girl whose mom killed your sister?" For Denver to even hear that question, it made her have to register something that she didn't want to believe about her mother. And she was in so much disbelief that when she went home, she couldn't even ask the question to her mom or baby Suggs. And I think a part of that was that she just emotionally was not prepared for the response. Okay, so Beloved is pulling Setha out of her past. She's making Denver deal with her past. And then in this chapter, we're going to see Beloved make Paul D deal with his past. So we don't see the confrontation happening between the characters like we did in the previous chapters, but we know that Paul D is not comfortable with Beloved being in the house. And so think about this chapter as like it's all in Paul D's memory, but as like having literary imagination. I want you guys to think about how Beloved is forcing Paul D to relive these experiences with her mere presence in the house. Okay, chapter 10, page 125. Let's get started. All right, out of sight. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to say is that there is some graphic language in this chapter. And then there's also hints at or allusions to the fact that Paul D was also sexually assaulted when he was in Alfred, Georgia. And that's going to be important to know for later things that happen in the book. All right, out of sight of Mr. Sight, away, praise his name, from the smiling boss of roosters, Paul D began to tremble, not all at once and not so anyone could tell. When he turned his head, aiming for a last look at brother, turned it as much as the rope that connected his neck to the axle of a buckboard allowed, and later on when they fastened the iron around his ankles and clamped the wrist as well, there was no outward sign of trembling at all. Nor 18 days after that, when he saw the ditches, the 1,000 feet of earth, 5 feet deep, 5 feet wide, into which wooden boxes had been fitted. A door of bars that you could lift on hinges, like a cage opened into 3 walls and a roof of scrap lumber and red dirt. 2 feet of it over his head, 3 feet of open trench in front of him, with anything that crawled or scurried welcome to share that grave calling itself quarters. And there were 45 more. He was sent there after trying to kill Brandywine, the man schoolteacher sold him to. Brandywine was leading him in a coffle with 10 others through Kentucky into Virginia. He didn't know exactly what prompted him to try, other than Hallie, Sixo, Paul A, Paul F, and Mr. But the trembling was fixed by the time he knew it was there. Okay, so remember, oh yeah, these chapters function as like these completed memories that we've been taken through. So we heard a little bit about Denver's birth in the very beginning of the book in chapter 3. And so then we get even more, chapter 3 or chapter 4, I forget. And so then we get even more in-depth details about Denver's birth and how Setha arrived to 124 in chapter 9. So it's like we get that completed picture from the time she leaves Sweet Home until the time that she arrives to 124. And so this chapter is going to do the same thing for Paul D. We're going to get the details of when he leaves Sweet Home. So he gets sold to this man named Brandywine. Remember that he gets walked off of Sweet Home and he's wearing the bit. And so that's why he can't talk to Hallie. And then this chapter is going to end with him ending up at 124. So we get these full circle pictures where we get like the picture completed, timelines completed between Sweet Home and their time at 124. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how oftentimes outbursts that happen, especially when the outbursts happen like person to person, it usually does not have to deal with the person who's standing in front of us, but often many things that have happened before. So Toni Morrison hints at that here at the end of that long paragraph where it says he didn't know exactly what prompted him to try, other than Hallie, who Paul D saw kind of get broken by witnessing Setha being sexually assaulted by school teachers' nephews. 6-0, we still don't really know what happened to him. Paul A, Paul F, we don't know what happened to them either. And then Mr. And we heard in chapter 8 at the end of that chapter how traumatizing it was for Paul D to walk by Mr. the Rooster when he was in the bit, knowing that the rooster was much more free than he was as a person. Okay. And then the other detail that you need to know is Toni Morrison continues with this idea of dehumanization. The men who are in this enslaved prison, essentially, they are kept underground in a trench. And then there's just like a lid that, okay, so there's a big hole that's been dug into the ground. And then there's a lid on top that opens and closes and lets the men in and out. And there's like kind of some creepy details that go along with this to really try to get you into understanding how terrible this must have been for the conditions, where it says 2 feet of it over his head, 3 feet of open trench in front of him, with anything that crawled or scurried welcome to share that grave calling itself quarters. And there's also, she compares it to a grave because Paul D also feels very much not dead, but not alive. And maybe it gives explanation to why she uses that metaphor of a tobacco tin, making it rusted shut so that he does feel like he is dead inside after this experience. Okay, still no one else knew it because it began inside. A flutter of a kind in the chest and the shoulder blades. It felt like rippling, gentle at first and then wild. As though the further south they led him, the more his blood, frozen like an ice pond for 20 years, began thawing, breaking into pieces that once melted had no choice but to swirl and eddy. Sometimes it was in his leg, then again it moved to the base of his spine. By the time they unhitched him from the wagon and saw nothing but dogs and 2 shacks in a world of sizzling grass, the roiling blood was shaking him to and fro. But no one could tell. The wrists he held out for the bracelets that evening were steady, as were the legs he stood on when chains were attached to the leg irons. But when they shoved him into the box and dropped the cage door down, his hands quit taking instruction. On their own they traveled. Nothing could stop them or get their attention. They would not hold his penis to urinate or a spoon to scoop lumps of lima beans into his mouth. The miracle of their obedience came with the hammer at dawn. Okay, all of his autonomy obviously has been taken away because he's been enslaved. It's even further taken away when he gets put into this jail. So he gets put into a chain gang, he gets linked together, and he does not have any autonomy to be able to make decisions for himself. So you have to imagine what it is like to be chained to 45 other men. If he's going to go eat a bite of lima beans, then everyone else has to do that coordinated effort with him. They all have to do it together. So they can't do anything independent for themselves. They're always thinking about the other people who they are attached to. All 46 men woke to rifle shot. All 46. 3 white men walked along the trench, unlocking the doors one by one. No one stepped through. When the last lock was opened, the 3 returned and lifted the bars one by one. And one by one, the black men emerged, promptly and without the poke of a rifle butt, if they had been there more than a day, promptly with the butt if, like Paul D., they had just arrived. When all 46 were standing in a line in the trench, another rifle shot signaled the climb out, and up to the ground above, where 1,000 feet of the best hand-forged chain in Georgia stretched. Each man bent and waited. The first man picked up the end and threaded it through the loop on his leg iron. He stood up then and, shuffling a little, brought the chain tip to the next prisoner, who did likewise. As the chain was passed on and each man stood in the other's place, the line of men turned around, facing the boxes they had come out of. Not one spoke to the other, at least not with words. The eyes had to tell what there was to tell. Help me this morning, Spad. I'ma make it. New man. Steady now, steady. Chain up completed, they knelt down. The dew, more likely than not, was missed by then, heavy sometimes, and if the dogs were quiet and just breathing, you could hear doves. Kneeling in the mist, they waited for the whim of a guard, or 2 or 3, or maybe all of them wanted it. Wanted it from one prisoner in particular, or none, or all. Okay, so this is the graphic scene that I was telling you about, so just a heads up here. All of the men, once they get chained up together, they all kneel down before they start their day's work. So this is a guard who's speaking, who asks, breakfast? Want some breakfast? Yes, sir. Hungry? Yes, sir. Here you go. Occasionally, a kneeling man chose gunshot in his head as the price, maybe, of taking a bit of foreskin with him to Jesus. Paul D. did not know that then. He was looking at his palsied hands, smelling the guards, listening to his soft grunt, so like the doves, as he stood before the man kneeling in mist on his right. Convinced he was next, Paul D. retched, vomiting up nothing at all. An observing guard smashed his shoulder with a rifle, and the engaged one decided to skip the new man for the time being, lest his pants and shoes got soiled by puke. Hi! It was the first sound other than yes, sir, a black man was allowed to speak each morning, and the lead chain gave it everything he had. Hi! It was never clear to Paul D. how he knew when to shout that mercy. They called him High Man, and Paul D. thought at first the guards told him when to give the signal that let the prisoners rise up off their knees and dance 2-step to the music of hand-forged iron. Later, he doubted it. He believed to this day that the High Man at dawn and the ho when evening came were the responsibility High Man assumed when he knew, because he alone knew what was enough, what was too much, when things were over, when the time had come. They chain danced over the fields, through the woods to the trail that ended in the astonishing beauty of Feldspar, and there Paul D's hands disobeyed the furious rippling of his blood and paid attention. With the sledgehammer in his hands and High Man's lead, the men got through. They sang it out and beat it up, garbling the words so they could not be understood, tricking the words so their syllables yielded up other meanings. They sang the women they knew, the children they had been, the animals they had tamed themselves or seen others tame. They sang of bosses and masters and misses, of mules and dogs and the shamelessness of life. They sang lovingly in graveyards and sisters long gone, of pork in the woods, meal in the pan, fish on the line, cane, rain, and rocking chairs. Okay, before we started reading the book, we saw that little video talking about the power of music and how music has the opportunity to be able to connect us to each other. And music also has the ability to say what some may leave unspoken. So we see that here. And Toni Morrison really builds in this idea of even in these direst conditions where things are so utterly terrible, there's still this resilience of the human spirit, and there's still this willingness to be able to carry themselves through. Even some of the descriptions that she says, like if you imagine these men who are chained together, she calls it chain danced over the fields, and that they sing these songs to be able to connect with each other and communicate. And there's even like a playfulness with language and like creativity associated with it when it says that they sang out loud and beat it up, garbling the words so that they could not be understood, tricking the words so their syllables yielded up other meanings. These are the things that they have to do to distract themselves from, or maybe not even distract themselves, but to get through the work that they are facing and the conditions that they're living through. Okay, and they beat the women for having known them and no more, no more. The children for having been them, but never again. They killed the boss so often and so completely they had to bring him back to life to pulp him one more time. Tasting hot meal cake among pine trees, they beat it away. Singing love songs to Mr. Death, they smashed his head. More than the rest, they killed the flirt whom folks called life for leading them on, making them think the next sunrise would be worth it, that another stroke of time would do it at last. Only then she was dead. Only when she was dead would they be safe. The successful ones, the ones who had been there enough years to have maimed, mutilated, maybe even buried her, kept watch over the others who were still in her hug, carrying and looking forward, remembering and looking back. They were the ones who I said, "Help me's bad," or "Look out," meaning this might be the day I bay or eat my own mess or run. And it was this last that had to be guarded against. For if one pitched and ran, all 46 would be yanked by the chain that bound them, and no telling who or how many would be killed. A man could risk his own life, but not his brother's. So the eye said, "Steady now, and hang by me." Okay, there's also a tremendous amount of care that's built into how these men treat each other because they know that their fate is bound up with the other men that they're chained to. And they all have had various amounts of time of being in this chain gang. So some are much more broken than others, but still they know that they have to be together in order to get through this. And it's going to pay off for them in the next scene. Okay. 86 days and done. Life was dead. Haldy beat her butt all day, every day, till there was not a whimper in her. 86 days and his hands were still, waiting serenely, each rat rustling night for "Hi" at dawn and the eager clench on the hammer shaft. Life rolled over dead, or so he thought. It rained. Snakes came down from the shortleaf pine and hemlock. It rained. Cypress, yellow poplar, ash, and palmetto drooped under 5 days of rain without wind. By the eighth day, the doves were nowhere in sight. By the ninth, even the salamanders were gone. Dogs laid their ears down and stared over their paws. The men could not work. Chain up was slow, breakfast abandoned. The two-step became a slow drag over soupy grass and unreliable earth. Okay, so to say simply what Toni Morrison says beautifully here is that it's raining so hard that the land is becoming mud. And so they're not allowed to work outside, or they're incapable of being able to work outside like they usually do. So all the men are going to get locked in their boxes for the time being. And I want you to pay attention to this next paragraph. It was decided to lock everybody down in the boxes till it either stopped or lightened up so a white man could walk, damn it, without flooding his gun. Okay, so think about the conditions of these men and what they're living through. And the biggest inconvenience of this rain is the fact that his gun gets flooded. And then also it continues and says, and the dogs could quit shivering. So we've talked about the dehumanization, and then the scene where Paul D says that it kind of made him feel broken inside to know that a chicken was more free than him. That's echoed in this description of the dogs, that the dog security and warmth is prioritized more than these men. The chain was threaded through 46 loops of the best hand-forged iron in Georgia. It rained. In the boxes, oh wait, okay, so there's one more thing that I want to talk to you guys about before we read this paragraph. If you guys can remember at the beginning of chapter 8 when Denver and Beloved are talking, and we know that Denver knows that Beloved is baby Beloved who's returned from the dead. And remember, I showed you those two images. There was like the scene of hell where it looked like angels were falling, and then there was all the conflict and the battles that were happening. And it was a depiction of the afterlife. And then I also showed you side by side the images of the slave ships in the Middle Passage, and how when Beloved talks about how dark and cramped and hot it is, how that ambiguous language can be used to talk about both. So Beloved has lived through all of these memories of her ancestors. And then this next scene here that's described with Paul D getting free, I want you to think about how this scene could also be encompassed in that language that Beloved has used, where she says that where she came from before, it was hot, it was cramped, and there was also dead people around her. Okay. In the boxes, the men heard the water rise in the trench and looked out for cottonmouths. They squatted in muddy water, slept above it, peed in it. Paldy thought he was screaming. His mouth was open and there was no loud throat-splitting sound, but it may have been somebody else. Then he thought he was crying. Something was running down his cheeks. He lifted his hand to wipe away the tears and saw dark brown slime. Above him, rivulets of mud slid through the boards of the roof. When it come down, he thought, gonna crush me like a tick bug. It happened so quick he had no time to ponder. Somebody yanked the chain once, hard enough to cross his legs and throw him into the mud. He never figured out how he knew, how anybody did, but he did know. He did. And he took both hands and yanked the length of the chain at his left so the next man would know too. The water was above his ankles, flowing over the wooden plank he slept on. And then it wasn't water anymore. The ditch was caving in, the mud oozed under and through the bars. Okay, so all the men are locked in their cage underground. The land is getting loose, and so the men decide that they can either surrender and they're probably going to die from suffocation from the mud, or if they coordinate it all together, they can make themselves get free. They waited, each and every one of the 46, not screaming, although some of them must have fought like the devil not to. The mud was up to his thighs, and he held on to the bars. Then it came, another yank, from the left this time, and less forceful than the first because of the mud it passed through. It started like the chain up, but the difference was the power of the chain. One by one, from high man back on down the line, they dove. Down through the mud, under the bars, blind, groping. Some had sense enough to wrap their heads in their shirts, cover their faces with rags, put on their shoes. Others just plunged, simply ducked down and pushed out, fighting up, reaching for air. Some lost direction, and their neighbors, feeling the confused pull of the chain, snatched them around. For one lost, all lost. The chain that held them would save all or none, and High Man was the delivery. They talked through the chain like Sam Morse and Great God. They all came up. Like the unshriven dead, zombies on the loose, holding the chains in their hands, they trusted the rain and the dark, yes, but mostly High Man and each other. Okay, so they're up out of the mud and they're going to start running through the forest to try to find some place that they can get free. So again, remember it's 46 men who are all chained together. They're going to be trying to move through the forest without getting caught. Past the guards where the dogs lay in deep depression, past the 2 guard shacks, past the stable of sleeping horses, past the hens whose bills were bolted into their feathers, they waited. The moon did not help because it wasn't there. The field was a marsh, the track a trough. All Georgia seemed to be sliding, melting away. Moss wiped their faces as they fought the live oak branches that blocked their way. Georgia took up all of Alabama and Mississippi then, so there was no state line to cross, and it wouldn't have mattered anyway. If they had known about it, they would have avoided not only Alfred and the beautiful feldspar, but Savannah too, and headed for the Sea Islands on the river that slid down from the Blue Ridge Mountains. But they didn't know. Daylight came and they huddled in a copse of red bud trees. Night came and they scrambled up to higher ground, praying the rain would go on, shielding them and keeping folks at home. They were hoping for a shack, solitary, some distance from its big house, where a slave might be making rope or heating potatoes at the grate. What they found was a camp of sick Cherokee, from whom a rose was named. Okay, Toni Morrison is going to embed some history into these last couple of chapters. So the Cherokee who are here are the Cherokee who refused to partake in the Trail of Tears, moving them out of their land to Oklahoma. And the consequence of that is that they suffer. So people die, they get disease. And Toni Morrison, I think that she's trying to create some parallels between the experience of the indigenous people and then also the enslaved men who come across them in the forest. She's also going to criticize this narrative that has been said about Native American people in America's past, that they were uncivilized or that they were an issue, and that they were actually, from the details that she provides here, they were cooperative and they were also very intelligent. Okay, so let's read. Decimated but stubborn, they were among those who chose a fugitive life rather than Oklahoma. So they decided to not go to Oklahoma as part of the Trail of Tears. They decided to stay at their home that they know is their home. The illness that swept them now was reminiscent of the one that had killed half their number 200 years earlier. In between that calamity and this, they had visited George III in London, published a newspaper, made baskets, led Oglethorpe through forest, helped Andrew Jackson fight Creek, cooked maize, drawn up a constitution, petitioned the King of Spain, been experimented on by Dartmouth, established asylums, wrote their language, resisted settlers, shot bear, and translated scripture, all to no avail. So they go through all of these difficulties. They learn how to do all of these things. And none of that helps them in order to maintain their autonomy and allowing the land to remain theirs. The forced move to the Arkansas River, insisted upon by the same president they fought for against the Creek, Andrew Jackson, as mentioned previously, destroyed another quarter of their already shattered number. That was it, they thought, and removed themselves from those Cherokee who signed the treaty in order to retire into the forest and wait the end of the world. The disease they suffered now was a mere inconvenience compared to the devastation they remembered. Still, they protected each other as best they could. The healthy were sent some miles away, the sick stayed behind with the dead, to survive or join them. The prisoners from Alfred, Georgia, sat down in semicircle near the encampment. No one came, and still they sat. Hours passed, and the rain turned soft. Finally, a woman stuck her head out from her house. Night came, and nothing happened. At dawn, two men with barnacles covering their beautiful skin approached them. No one spoke for a moment. Then High Man raised his hand. The Cherokee saw the chains and went away. When they returned, each carried a handful of small axes. Two children followed with a pot of mush cooling and thinning in the rain. Buffalo men, they called them, and they talked slowly to the prisoners, scooping mush and tapping away at their chains. Nobody from a box in Alfred, Georgia, cared about the illness the Cherokee warned them about, so they stayed, all 46, resting and planning their next move. Paul D had no idea of what to do and knew less than anybody, it seemed. He heard his co-convicts talk knowledgeably of rivers and states and towns and territories. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for a beloved explanation, but also thinking about your assessments for paper 2. If you are given a prompt that asks you to talk about solidarity, there's some very clear solidarity that's happening here between the Cherokee and these 46 men who are part of this chain gang that Paul D was a part of. And that when they see them chained up together, their immediate reaction is to go find the things that can help them be free. So there are parallels that are existing here. You can make some connections between Sapamla and the way that he writes about Black consciousness and this idea of unity and that everyone's freedom is bound up in one collected effort. You can use this passage potentially in the future. Okay, so they have space for them to be able to rest and process for what their plan is going to be up next. So in the remaining page and a half of the chapter, we're going to hear about what happens to Paul D between the time that he gets free and the time that he ends up at 124. Okay. He heard his co-convicts talk knowledgeably of rivers and states and towns and territories. Heard Cherokee men describe the beginning of the world and its end. Listened to tales of other buffalo men they knew, 3 of whom were in the healthy camp a few miles away. High Man wanted to join them. Others wanted to join him. Some wanted to leave, some to stay on. Weeks later, Paul D was the only buffalo man left without a plan. All he could think of was tracking dogs, although High Man said the rain they left in gave that no chance of success. Alone, the last man with buffalo hair among the ailing Cherokee, Paul D finally woke up and, admitting his ignorance, asked how he might get north. Free north, magical north, welcoming, benevolent north. The Cherokee smiled and looked around. The flood rains of a month ago had turned everything to steam and blossoms. That way, he said, pointing. Follow the tree flowers, he said. Only the tree flowers. As they go, you go. You will be where you want to be when they are gone. So he raced from dogwood to blossoming peach. When they thinned out, he headed for cherry blossoms, then magnolia, chinaberry, pecan, walnut, and prickly pear. At last, he reached a field of apple trees whose flowers were just becoming tiny knots of fruit. Spring sauntered north, but he had to run like hell to keep it at his traveling companion. From February to July, he was on the lookout for blossoms. When he lost them, he found himself without as much as a petal to guide him. He paused, climbed a tree on a hillock, and scanned the horizon for a flash of pink or white in the leaf world that surrounded him. He did not touch them or stop to smell. He merely followed in their wake, a dark, ragged figure guided by the blossoming plums. The apple field turned out to be Delaware, where the Weaver lady lived. She snapped him up as soon as he finished the sausage she fed him, and he crawled into her bed crying. She passed him off as her nephew from Syracuse simply by calling him that nephew's name. 18 months and he was looking out again for blossoms, only this time he did the looking on a dray. It was some time before he could put Alfred, Georgia, 6-0, schoolteacher, Hallie, his brothers, Setha, Mr., the taste of iron, the sight of butter, the smell of hickory, notebook paper, one by one, into the tobacco tin lodged in his chest. By the time he got to 124, nothing in this world could pry it open. Okay, so we see that Paul D has to go through this process of escaping his past, trying to get north. And in that effort, he never really has one place to be able to call home. So that makes some sense for why he's so nervous and apprehensive to make a home with Setha. And then he also has all of these things that he's kept inside him that he then locks inside that tobacco tin. And it lists it here, like his trauma from Alfred, Georgia, 6-0 school teacher, Hallie, his brothers, Setha, Mr., the taste of iron from the bit, the sight of butter, seeing Hallie broken, the smell of hickory. Okay, so we still don't really know what that is, but you should be curious. Notebook paper, one by one, into the tobacco tin, lodged in his chest. By the time he got to 124, nothing in this world could pry it open. And we also know from Setha's details in the previous chapter that school teacher kept detailed notes on the terrible things that he and his nephews did to the people at Sweet Home. And so we know that that not only happened to Setha, but it also happened to Paul D at this paragraph here. Okay, and that is chapter 10. Bye.